The British International School of Houston is an international and diverse private school with top academic results in a state-of-the-art 32-acre campus. From PK3 through 12th grade, students build pathways to the world's best universities through excellent results in internationally recognized qualifications. Guiding them are teachers who are global talents. Interested in learning more about the British International School of Houston? Search BIS Houston online and get in touch with their admissions team. And you can also join them for their upcoming open house by registering online. I am so grateful for my daughter's teachers. And if you love teachers like I do, here's your chance to show it. Nominate an incredible Houston area public school teacher for a free weekend retreat at the Holdsworth Center on Lake Austin. It's a one-of-a-kind experience designed to help teachers unplug, recharge, and feel appreciated. It only takes 2 minutes to nominate, but it could mean the world to a teacher. Nominations close August 29th, so go right now to teacherretreat.org to nominate someone today. That's teacherretreat.org. 20 years ago this week, Hurricane Katrina made landfall on the Gulf Coast, devastating New Orleans. It changed the Big Easy forever, but it also changed Houston. We received over 200,000 evacuees, and many of them decided to make H-Town home. Today on CityCast Houston, Katrina's lasting impact. First, former Houston Mayor Bill White joins me to share what it was like to answer the call for help. Then I'm sitting down with a survivor and author who just published a novel that unpacks her grief with words. It's Monday, August 25th. I'm Raheel Ramzanali, and here's what Houston's talking about. Mayor White, welcome into CityCast Houston. I'm so excited to talk to you. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's great to join you.
Hey, take me back to those first few days after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. You know, we were all watching, and it seemed like for the first few days, things were somewhat okay. But then you got a call during a Houston City Council meeting. Who was on the phone and what did they say?
Well, actually, what occurred was we had firefighters pre-deployed. I'd been watching the hurricane every day about 6 o'clock a.m. I would tune into the National Hurricane Center, and we saw it headed to New Orleans. Then the morning after landfall, when a lot in the national media was panning the streets and looking for damage, it sort of looked like things were okay. I found the head of Shell USA called me to say that the levees had been breached. And I knew at that moment that the city of New Orleans would be rendered uninhabitable because they would not be able to have electricity or water, and it would take a long time to revive those systems. So it was that day where I called in a senior city leadership and said that I was going to be busy for months and that they should make sure that all the needs of Houston were taken care of. And I began organizing our efforts.
So you started organizing before you received any official word from Louisiana state leadership.
Oh, yeah, sure. Or FEMA or anybody else. I mean, so, I called the head of the lead director of Walmart, said I needed the supply chain. I started getting on the phone with the archbishop and the leaders of mega churches and faith-based groups. I mobilized their volunteers. I'm going to be calling on them. And then we did have to open the Reliance Center at George R. Brown, which had not been up to that point designated as Red Cross centers. There were a bunch of Red Cross centers throughout the area, and we converted them in very short order into massive centers where people could sleep and eat and until we could start the process, which I began, moving people into apartments.
So it sounds like you were ready to go and you were already ahead of it. So when Louisiana calls and they're like, hey, we need help with our residents, can they come to Houston? Can you help us out with this? What was inside you that made you think ahead and just say yeah, we're going to be ready for this?
Well, I'd read a book about the Louisiana levee system called Control of Nature by John McPhee. And, the city of New Orleans is below sea level. If the levees break, then the city is flooded. and the city is flooded. Its water, sewer system, and electricity go down, and the water is contaminated. Buildings would quickly develop mold and become uninhabitable. So I knew that we had a major disaster in front of us. And, there were probably 80,000 people in our metropolitan area before the mandatory evacuation order, which was that, fairly late in the process that Sunday. Just people would come to hotels and were staying at churches and with friends and relatives. And then another large group of people was streaming in by car where there were traffic jams. And then there were people who were without transportation. Our cars had been flooded, and they had allowed the mass transit buses of New Orleans to be flooded. They started coming in by busloads, including later those that were evacuated from the Dome Stadium there. That was chaos. So the evacuation took several days. But look, we're the biggest major city down the interstate highway, and a lot of people have friends and relatives there. They know where Houston is. So it didn't take somebody in New Orleans say, go to Houston, or somebody from Houston say, come here. People started heading into Houston.
Yeah, we've always been cousins. We've been neighbors and, are always interconnected with I-10, even with all the traffic. That's part of the connection there. But, like thinking back, Mayor, you received thousands of evacuees. You had to give them shelter. You had to give them resources. And then, as you mentioned, when the resettlement process started, had to help with that, with the apartments. This was a massive undertaking, but you carried it out with a quiet sense of calm and focus. And you did it alongside your Republican counterpart, Harris County Judge Robert Eccles. Why do you think y'all both work so well together and collaboratively?
Well, one is just a matter of temperament. We share the same faith, and in the scripture of our faith, it says that those who are blessed. When I was a stranger, you took me in. When I was naked, you clothed me. What guided me was that we wanted our fellow Americans from the New Orleans area to be treated just like we would want to be treated if we had to evacuate Houston and if it was rendered uninhabitable. But the Red Cross and FEMA playbook, the disaster playbook, was written for areas which experienced a hurricane, and then you'd set up these temporary shelters that had provisions for, 36 to 72 hours. And then the assumption was that the hurricane winds and storm surge would recede, like many hurricanes, and people would go back home. In this case, it wasn't so much the hurricane. It was the fact that New Orleans was below sea level, and it was protected by water, the Mississippi River, by a levee system. The levees broke. And as the city started flooding from the Mississippi River, then it was a totally different situation. And I had to make up basically a housing program. FEMA had its solution, which was to, contract for $500 million for ocean liners. And they started ordering, mobile homes by the thousands that they set up in these mobile home cities in parts of Louisiana and Arkansas. I didn't think that was right. I thought that what was needed was to get people back on their feet. They need to be in apartments that were furnished, that had utilities, enough money to get on their feet. We provided clothing or clothing vouchers for people. And, I urged people to go on with their lives if they had kids. It was the beginning of the school year. If your child is in school and they get behind for a couple of months at the beginning of the year, it can affect their performance through that year. So I was very concerned about getting kids in school, identifying those people who had disabilities. Of course, there was a whole other program that we were monitoring and supervising to provide for medical care for the people who were evacuated from hospitals in the area, and provide medical services, which we did. We set up 2 virtual hospitals in the George R. Brown and the Reliance Center. So those were some of the things. But innovating the housing program and getting enough furniture and utilities turned on, refrigerators and all that thing for all the housing. That was, a big priority.
And it was such a compassionate thing to do. And it was also one of the reasons where so many residents from New Orleans who had to come down here and find some safe space. They ended up staying in Houston and called Houston home from that moment on. So with that in mind, how do you think Hurricane Katrina changed our city?
First, we were blessed to have a large number of new residents. And, some of the people who stayed, we didn't want you to stay. The people who had criminal acts, and it took a little while to get some of the criminals out of town or behind bars. But for the vast majority of law-abiding residents, the vast majority of people, it's a free country. You can live wherever you want. There are hundreds of thousands of people currently in Houston before Katrina who had come from, Louisiana, including my wife. So the one lasting impact is we had, productive citizens in our community. There was another impact too, that the Houstonians, when they saw all the tens of thousands or probably 50 to 100,000 volunteers that were engaged in the efforts, when they saw that everybody was doing things and that we were a shining light to the nation of how you could respond with competence and compassion when the federal government's response was lagging and chaotic, when the state of Louisiana was overwhelmed, obviously, Houstonians took a lot of pride in that, and justifiably so.
The disaster, I went back and watched this documentary on it, and just the scale of it. If this were to happen again today, I'm curious, with the way our political climate is right now, so polarized, do you think Houston would step up again? Do you think we would see leaders on both sides come together from opposite ends of the aisle and help out everybody? What do you think?
I certainly would hope so. I mean, taking care of human needs is not a partisan issue. It's a really, practical issue that we confront. And I got to say, we were confronted several years later on terms of a hurricane wind, Hurricane Ike, which also occurred when I was in office. That was near the worst case hurricane that we had in terms of wind speed, 90 to 110-mile-an-hour winds. All the power was knocked out in every substation. There were 1 million trees that were down, many on top of power lines that we had to remove and get mulched. And I think the Katrina experience helped the various leaders understand what could be done if you harnessed all the resources of the community, not just those within the government emergency response. But there's something else too. I mean, look, I used to go to church services every Sunday. Every Sunday I was mayor, I stayed through the whole service, a lot in African-American churches, and I visited a lot of people. And a comment that I heard time and time again was that we passed civil rights laws and others, but attitudes, the law doesn't change attitudes. And I heard so many people saying, the majority of the people from New Orleans who were evacuees, not all, but the majority were African American. And the vast majority of Houstons viewed them simply as fellow Americans, not as somebody based on their race or income level or anything like that. And that really sort of was a turning point, I think, in the realization in our community that we had really turned the corner from being the Southern segregationist city that we had been just decades earlier. And that is a lasting impact. When you saw what happened in other cities compared to our cities after the death of George Floyd, this city came together.
Yeah.
And you had the police marching with people who were commemorating the death. And that is something that you didn't see in so many cities, including, so-called progressive cities in the North.
Yeah. Houston opened its arms and accepted everybody. And, those who survived Katrina became part of our fabric, became part of our community. We're actually going to be speaking to a Hurricane Katrina survivor, Kionna, in just a minute. But I want to leave on this. What do you think Houstonians need to remember about the people who survived and made Houston their home?
We're lucky to have people that are productive, that are looking forward, I think. It's just like a lot of first-generation Americans, they take more pride in being an American than a lot of people who inherited it. And I think you have a lot of people, including Kionna, by the way, who their feelings for this city, they have a great passion for this city, in part because they saw firsthand what we're capable of at our best.
We should never forget about that compassion. That's what makes Houston, Houston. And it started with you, Bill White. Thank you so much, Mayor. I appreciate it.
Take care.
Owning rental property in Houston isn't simple. Between finding tenants, keeping up with lease paperwork, rent collection, and staying on top of accounting, there's always something to manage. Whether it's a townhome in Montrose or a house in the Heights, Turbo Tenant makes it easy to manage your rental property. It's a free all-in-one platform built for independent landlords. So you can market your listing, screen tenants, sign leases, collect rent, and even keep your accounting in check all in one platform. And yes, Turbo Tenant keeps up with Texas rental laws, so your leases and documents are always legally compliant. More than 800,000 landlords nationwide trust Turbo Tenant, and it's earned a 4.8 star rating from over 15,000 reviews by landlords and tenants alike. One landlord using Turbo Tenant even saved $500 in accountant fees because the bookkeeping was so streamlined. So if you're a Houston landlord, stop juggling spreadsheets, group text, and payment apps. Get everything you need in one place. Sign up for free today at turbotenant.com. That's turbotenant.com, your smarter way to manage rentals in Houston.
CityCast is brought to you by Wise, the app for international people using money around the globe. With Wise, you can send, spend, and receive up to 40 currencies with only a few simple taps, and save up to 55% compared to major banks. Plus, Wise won't add hidden fees to your transfer. Whether you're buying souvenirs with pesos in Puerto Vallarta or sending euros to tip your Coliseum tour guide, you know you're getting a fair exchange rate with no extra markups. That's what makes Wise the fast, affordable way to use your money around the globe. Wise offers 24/7 live support and runs over 7 million daily checks to catch and prevent fraud, so you know your money is where it's supposed to be. Be smart. Join the 15 million customers who choose Wise. Download the Wise app today or visit wise.com. Learn more by visiting wise.com/US/compare. Terms and conditions apply.
As Mayor White mentioned, thousands of New Orleans residents came to Houston, some by bus and some driving on I-10 with their families and whatever belongings they could grab. One of them was author Kionna Walker LeMalle. She joins me to talk about how Hurricane Katrina changed her life. How did Hurricane Katrina change your life after you evacuated and came to Houston during Katrina?
Wow, that's a loaded question. I don't know anyone who has lived through Katrina who does not describe life in terms of pre-Katrina and post-Katrina. It's like there is a fault line between life before the storm and life after the storm. For one, I was born and raised in New Orleans. I never returned to New Orleans to live after the storm. And that in and of itself is huge because I was born and raised there and I never intended to leave. I never expected to leave. I was 30 the year Hurricane Katrina hit. At the time, my husband and I had 2 toddlers and an infant. We found out we were pregnant with our 4th about a week after we found out we lost our home as well as our source of income. And that's one of the things that's, I think, so different about Katrina is that it wasn't just that a lot of people lost their homes. We lost our city.
Yeah.
Like you couldn't just re-enter the city. You couldn't just return to your job. A lot of places never opened again, or they didn't open again for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year. So all of those things changed. Before the storm, my husband was a youth and young adult pastor at Franklin Avenue Baptist Church. We had a thriving youth ministry, more than 500 active students. We did not at all, anticipate that particular work in ministry ending when it did. But the entire church was submerged and our membership was scattered, some in Houston, some in Tennessee and Baton Rouge. Like people were just in so many different places. We gradually began to reconnect.
Yeah.
But we never went back to that. We had to start life over again, completely differently. I could
Of
talk
course.
about what's different for,
Yeah.
forever, just down to just not even having the same items in your kitchen drawer. There are moments when I go to look for something 20 years later and I have to remind myself, oh, I had that.
It's unimaginable, right? Because before Hurricane Katrina, I don't think any New Orleans resident like yourself would have thought that this would result in me never living in my city again and having to evacuate. How did you evacuate?
We actually evacuated before the mandatory evacuation was ordered. So the Saturday before the flood waters rose, it took us 16 hours to get
Oh my
to
God.
Houston. But when we decided to leave, we just decided to leave and take advantage of what we assumed would be a longer weekend. We thought we would go and see my great grandmother and his grandmother here in Houston, and that's not how it worked out.
Kionna, you grew up in New Orleans, but you also had family roots in Houston. Your great grandmother was an influential civil rights leader and founder of Houston's first Black Lutheran church. But even with those roots, what was it like restarting?
Here's the thing, right? We came in not expecting to have to restart. We had 2 outfits each. We had swimwear because we were going to go to Waterworld, and we actually did. The babies each had one stuffed animal, and that's all we had with us. We did not secure photos, home videos. We didn't try to move things, into the attic for safety.
Yeah.
We had no idea we were going to experience the degree of flooding that we experienced. And I still remember the moment the flood water started rising, or the moment it was reported, being in Houston. I was in my grandmother's kitchen making a sandwich. And from her kitchen, you could see the TV in her bedroom. And we were talking about getting on the road Tuesday,
To go
to
back.
return home.
Yeah.
And because, we had heard, okay, New Orleans was spared. Everything, was okay. We could start returning home. And that was our conversation when the news report broke that the levees had broken. And there was, imagery on the screen where you could literally see the waters rising. It was unbelievable. It was like, how's that water rising like that? Didn't. And we just
Yeah.
looked at each other silently for several seconds, like, what just happened? But even in that moment, we didn't know what that meant, right? I mean, did that mean we won't be home for 3 or 4 more days?
Yeah.
We had no way even then of conceptualizing what was about to unfold.
And that experience led you to write a fictional novel called Behind the Waterline. What moved you to write about it, especially as a fictional novel, because this is such a real life experience?
So here's the fun fact and the inside scoop. I never intended to write a Hurricane Katrina novel. That was not what I set out to write. I was actually in the process of writing a broken love story about the grandmother in my novel. I was writing her experience of being a civil rights activist in college who was in an interracial relationship, and how that turned upside down and what happened to her and what trauma she was dealing with. That was actually what I was writing. But what happened was at some point I sat down and I started mapping out the characters' lives over time because I was working with the grandmother's life in the 1960s, but I was working with a lot of flashbacks. It was about 2010, the year that the story was unfolding. And so when I got to 2005, all of the main characters had been hit in some way by Hurricane Katrina. And so at that point, I had a decision to make as a writer. Do I allow that to just be kind of a conversation in passing? The reality, though, was that it was so huge a factor in my life. And I had been working on a story about Hurricane Katrina, but that had been put on the back burner as I was working on this other novel. And so as I tried to just reconcile this issue of what do I do about this storm? This storm changes absolutely everything. How do I navigate that? Yeah. That is when Katrina entered the novel. And then Katrina began to take over the novel. And a lot of that, I think, was because I was suddenly actively processing what happened 20 years ago. And so what ended up happening was Hurricane Katrina became the plot of the novel. Hurricane Katrina became, this is what is happening now. And the grandmother's civil rights legacy became the form. This is what happened already, right? So the grandmother in the novel had been keeping her civil rights history a secret. And one of the things that happens when you lose everything in a storm like Hurricane Katrina, when your house is flooded with flood water, right? It's going to be gutted out. And when your house is gutted out, any secret you stored in that house is suddenly public facing. And those stories don't hit the news, right? People aren't on the news like saying, so I am worried about what's going to happen to that video that I had hidden, like, is someone going to end up watching that? Is someone going to find the letters that I had tucked in my drawer in a hidden place that, my spouse doesn't even know about, right? And so if you're keeping some kind of secret, and the reality is we all have secrets, right? We all have things that, we hide in our homes, right? But when you're facing this kind of tragedy, you don't get to hide it anymore. Like whatever it is potentially coming out against your will. So on top of losing everything, on top of the trauma of your entire infrastructure falling apart, you also have you have lost control of your narrative. Right? Because you are suddenly completely vulnerable. So that was a big part of how those stories came together. And the reality that when the flood water started rising, home just couldn't hold the secrets anymore.
The decision to combine the civil rights movement and the trauma from Hurricane Katrina, what went into it?
Once I realized there was this elephant in the room, named Hurricane Katrina, and I had to work with that, right? It became a very logical medium because I'd been dealing with this grandmother that wouldn't tell her story. And she wouldn't tell her story because she had been traumatized by her experiences, right? And so that trauma silenced her. But the problem with being silenced is we can't heal while we're silent. We can only heal when we begin to tell our stories and share our stories and actually reflect on and communicate our truth. So not only did her not sharing her story negatively impact her healing, but it also bled over into an impact on the grandson, right? So he was ostracized. He was misunderstood. He didn't have friends. All of those things are going on because of the way in which trauma silenced her, right? The thing about the storm is because we are suddenly in a situation where we are face to face with a vulnerability that dares us to remain silent, right? Anything that we have attempted to hide from others is coming out because now the walls of our houses are coming down, right? So it ended up being that this grandmother's trauma ends up being released through the disaster of the storm. Everything ends up opening up and pouring out in a way that she could not do it. She could not articulate it. So on the other side of that, there's healing from her trauma, but there's also healing and restoration from everything that was lost in the storm as well.
It's so hard to process that and just put myself in those shoes. So, I have to take a moment and just let that digest. But Kionna, let's talk about Houston when you ended up getting here and life is flipped upside down and you are stuck in this reality that with 2 pairs of clothes, Houston is now going to be your home for the foreseeable future. And it ended up being your home for the rest of this adult life so far, right? What was that like? How were you treated? How were you greeted as you settled in by Houstonians?
So first, let me say it ended up being our home for the immediate year after the storm. We did return to Central Louisiana for about 8 years before we settled back in Houston again. So that year, what was that like, right? First of all, we were met with what I can only describe as remarkable kindness. It is unbelievable, even when I consider where we are today as a country. I don't think we're anywhere near today where we were then with our level of empathy and concern for others. We found every resource we needed, every resource. So let me say this. First of all, we immediately went into my great-grandmother's home. But my great-grandmother's home is really small. It's a very small house in the 3rd Ward. She was in her 90s at the time. It was 6 of us, my mom, my husband, 2 toddlers, an infant. And then I found out I was pregnant, right? There weren't bedrooms in the house to accommodate us. Yeah. Initially, we didn't have anything, right? But then, we started getting clothing vouchers. There was also a ministry that adopted our family and collected clothing for our family. And I remember when that clothing arrived, we were going through the boxes, unpacking the boxes. Some of our same outfits were restored, which is insane to think about. So we posted about, oh my goodness, I had this and I got it again, and that was just things that were coming from donations. And then we realized we don't have anywhere to put these clothes. There's no closet space. There's no drawer space. There's nowhere to put anything. And there wasn't any space to put a crib, but we've got a 5-month-old, right? So he slept in a plastic drawer, for that time. My husband and I and our 2 toddler sons slept on the sofa bed, and we all stayed in the den. That was the beginning of starting over. But we got early Head Start services in Houston's 3rd Ward. My son learned to read, in Head Start here. We got a library card, and that was gold. That was like absolute gold, because with that library card, we could access the computers, we could access the internet, tend to business that we needed to tend to. Ultimately, we got some furniture from Gallery Furniture, of course, right? No surprises there.
Of course.
because we eventually did get out of my grandmother's house, and we got housing in Cy-Fair through the housing program that had literally been, put together, expanded upon in the aftermath of the storm under, Mayor Bill White's leadership. Like that, and it was in many ways a well-oiled machine. Everything that we had to do here was actually a little easier than everything we had to do in Louisiana as we were navigating our return. Like that was grueling, right? It was extremely difficult. It felt very slow.
Yeah.
But in Houston, we're able to pick up the pieces of our lives and get back on track again. We did not stay solely because my husband, as I said, was a youth and young adult pastor at the time that we left. And so our prayer as we were going through this, our prayer was, okay, God, where would you have us to serve next? That was the prayer. And God didn't send us back, to New Orleans. That was difficult. I never thought I would leave. But I surrendered to that. When I go and visit the city, when I go home, it's not the same city. There are aspects of it that are the same, right? There's a culture in New Orleans that's only New Orleans. And there are aspects of that, you still see pockets of it, and there are people who say about 2 million of the 4 million people returned. So about half the population that was there before the storm returned. The rest of the population, is people coming in and settling in New Orleans later, often because they started working there.
Yeah, they did. And, of those people who didn't return, 40,000, that's an estimated number, ended up staying in the city of Houston and were offered so many of the services and the compassionate givings that you're talking about from Houstonians. And they ended up calling Houston home. And you're in a unique position where, of course, you're from New Orleans and you are now in Houston and you've seen it change. So I'm curious, how did Hurricane Katrina change Houston?
I always think that the first thing is the food.
Food.
The food got so much better. New Orleanians, we would travel with our seasonings, travel with your meat. It's like you got to have certain kinds of meat. You have to have certain kinds of seasonings. I remember when, we started really settling in.
Yeah.
I remember initially going to the grocery store and like, where are the camellia red beans? Where's the Tony Sacheries? Like, just find those things that are like, these are basic things. Like these are staples. What do you mean you don't carry that? But then the store started to carry, some of our favorite things. I think it was in a fiesta initially that I, found some camellia red beans. I'm like, oh my goodness, they have the beans. Like they have the beans. It was like the most exciting thing. And now going to the grocery store doesn't really feel so different. I can find almost, any, traditional New Orleans meal that I want to cook. And also there's so many restaurants here that, that serve New Orleans cuisine done right. Because we've all been in places, especially, prior to Katrina, when, you go somewhere and they're like, we got that New Orleans food. And then you taste it and you're like, no, you don't,
It's missing something.
Yes.
You and so many other survivors still live with this trauma 20 years later.
Yes.
How much do you think you and other survivors have healed?
So I'm not the one who coined this expression. I heard it one day. And then when I heard it, it was clear to me that those were the words that describe my healing, my process, my grief. And that is that you never stop grieving, but you learn to wear your grief differently. And when we think about grief, often we're thinking about people and the passing of loved ones. And of course, that is also a large part of the Katrina story because we lost people to death. But you also grieve place, right? You
Yeah.
grieve just the presence and the atmosphere of that place. And I have never stopped grieving New Orleans. And we're 20 years later. That grief is still there. However, I wear it differently, right? I wear it in the form of having these conversations. I wear it
Yes.
in the form of cooking a meal, from back home. I wear it in the form of writing a novel, allowing that experience, allowing Katrina to take over that novel. That was a way that I worked through, right? But I was still
Yes.
processing and over processing. I do have post Katrina PTSD. Most people don't realize that because I don't seem to. But one of the things that happened on the other side of Katrina is I lost a lot of my memory capacity. So I always said my memory's trashed. It's really bad. I turned 30 the year of the storm, but the year I turned 31, I thought I was turning 30 because I had forgotten that I turned 30. I could
Oh my
not
God.
remember who was alive and who wasn't. And so I like it was all scrambled in my head. And then I wouldn't want to ask people, well, is so and so alive? Did you tell me that they passed? Can I find because it's not the kind of thing that you should forget, right? But that is a part of my PTSD. So I have to work really hard at memory. And I think part of it is that what the brain does, our brain is very powerful and it tries to self-preserve. So I think there's this thing that if I don't get over attached in the form of memory, then I can't feel it as much if I lose it because I didn't let it permanently attach anyway. And so that is a part of the PTSD that I navigate. And I have to force myself to work at and work at and work at and work at remembering. But I have noticed that on the other side of writing behind the waterline and allowing myself to relive, because I essentially had to relive a lot of what happened. Some of what I wrote came from firsthand experience. Some of what I wrote came from the stories of, my loved ones. Some of what I wrote came from being present, watching the footage on the news and experiencing it. On the other side of having done that, I have noticed some improvement in my memory. It's not what it was,
No.
before the storm, but it's also not as bad as it was before I wrote Behind the Waterline. So we're always going to be recovering. We are not
Always.
the same. But though we still grieve, that we have much restoration to celebrate. Life has in many ways been tremendously good. We have great community. We've met wonderful people. We live in an amazing place, And so on the other side of this storm, though we may grieve the New Orleans that we had pre-Katrina, we wear that grief differently today.
Kionna, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much for sharing your story, your trauma, your grief, and your wins and your community. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
That was author Kionna Walker LeMalle. You can check out her book, Behind the Waterline, with the link in our show notes. We also talked with former Houston Mayor Bill White, who received a John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award for his leadership in response to Hurricane Katrina. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with 3 friends. And be sure to subscribe to CityCast Houston if you haven't yet, along with our daily newsletter, Hey Houston, for more Houston history and news. That will do it for today. I'm Raheel Ramzanali. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something new.
thank you for telling me what I said, because I was about to tell you that I don't remember what I said exactly.